do everything that the Old Testament says?
No, of course
Why not?
Because Vax.
Okay, so for example, why don't we follow, mixing of fibers?
Because of Acts.
This is a great response. It's simple, it's to the point, flips it back on her. When it comes to Acts chapter 15, the Jerusalem Council, they are debating, now that we are saved by faith, what part of the law do Gentiles need to follow? So the law is not necessary at all for salvation. In fact, Acts 15 verses 11 says, on the contrary, we believe we are saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ in the same way that they are.
So this idea that there's sort of a demarcation between when we had to follow the law and now there's a theological reason that we do not have to follow the law, it's pretty unconvincing for a variety of reasons. First is the issue in Acts itself. Now, these gentlemen, I think, are being very flippantly hand-wavy by saying, oh, it's because of Acts that we don't have to follow the law anymore. But that's a weird argument because, for one, in this Jerusalem council that they point to, it's not that they just say, oh, we don't have to follow the law anymore. They actually provide a baseline of 4 other laws. They say we should at least be following these, or they, which I'll get to in a minute. But of these 4 laws that they provide, a couple are, to refrain from things that are strangled and from blood. These aren't laws that we regard anymore either. And so if you're making the argument that whatever they declared at the Jerusalem Council is what we need to be abiding by, we're not actually regarding that, and that doesn't follow. But the other thing is, in context, this has to do with what the Gentiles are meant to do. And so the council is trying to decide what those Gentiles should or should not be doing. And they decide, well, they don't have to follow the laws. However, the Jews still do follow them. And so the question is there a distinction between the standard for the Jews and the Gentiles? What's going on there? Is the law abolished for some and not others? And you can also ask the question, well, why, if they have these 4 baseline laws, why aren't certain things like, do not murder included in that list? And so before I get to the issue of the laws, there's also the issue of Jesus, who actually said that, not one stroke, not one piece of the law will pass away. It will all be fulfilled. And anyone who does not follow the least of these laws is considered the least in the kingdom of heaven. This doesn't sound like he's doing any sort of abolishing of the law. And later on, some theologians said that, well, he's talking more, metaphorically about the essence of the law, but you don't get that indication when Jesus is speaking. It's actually something that is imposed upon the meaning later on. So then that brings us to the issue of the laws themselves. So there are a variety, a mixture of tones with the laws. Some are good, some are neutral, and some are actually kind of bad. As far as the good laws are concerned, again, do not murder, do not commit adultery. Why are these not listed in the Acts Jerusalem Council? Are these laws abolished? Do we not need to follow these laws anymore? So the question is, of the good laws and of these neutral laws, like, don't mix fabrics, which ones are abolished and which ones aren't? Which ones do we follow or need to follow, and which ones should we or shouldn't we? This is just a mishmash of confusion. And certainly we'll all, and we do, disagree on which laws to follow and which ones not to. There's also the issue that some laws are actually kind of bad. Some having to do with slaves, some having to do with women, such as, a woman who was raped, in some cases, has to marry her rapist. Should we have been following these laws at all? It's questionable at best. But then there's, of course, the historical question, right? Which is to suggest that all of these laws are directly given by God's divine word doesn't really make a whole lot of sense when you consider we can see how a lot of these laws follow from other ancient cultures. They're almost copies, or at least responses to these other laws in these ancient cultures. And so to imagine that these were all directly given by God for the purposes of, just making them distinct followers of Yahweh, this is sort of an oversimplification. It doesn't really consider what's actually going on with the development and the redaction and the editing of the laws over time. And we can actually even see that just within the Bible, where where there are certain laws in Exodus, Deuteronomy, for example, that are iterations of the same thing, and they even change a little bit. So for all of these reasons, the switch from following the laws to not, for theological reasons, is really just a later development. Ultimately, the culture is a little bit unclear why we would have, and it's probably just sort of a fabrication, let's say, of the culture and the development of the culture over time. But I also quickly want to address the tone of this video, where you've got Andrew Wilson and Sean McDowell who are affirming the fact that we've got this theological shift. And the problem is, well, first of all, Andrew Wilson is not giving this response in good faith. He's clearly just trying to, find a way to prove Kyla wrong or whatever. And Sean McDowell, oddly enough, he just completely affirms this. He puts a stamp on it and says that this is a great response. Doesn't take into consideration all of these things that I've just noted. And typically, the question that Kyla asks comes in response to the whole issue of same-sex relationships and why we would believe that that's so important, but things like, mixing fabrics, not so important. And this is an important and good question to ask. And I think that her rhetorical point in asking this question is correct. And so any other argument, though, in response, like is given in this video, it's insufficient and really unhelpful. But finally, part of the problem with this apologetic argument is just the motivation. I mean, the language that they're using here is, he flipped it around on her, and they're talking in terms of having a debate and proving somebody wrong. It's not really having this conversation for the purpose of discovering what is most true. And ultimately, this is the problem with apologetics overall. It's really more focused on just finding ways of proving why it is that what you already think is correct, and it doesn't really have conversations in good faith. And so that's the major issue that's going on here. So there's actually a lot lacking here, not just in the argument that's being made, but how it's being made.